You're listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner, your source for investing made easy. Here's Andy Tanner.
Welcome to Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. Fun show on deck, intrigue and crime and fascinating story. And, you know, these are true stories that we get to learn from because, well, you know, I look at 2008 and there's a lot of things that feel the same to me. And so today we have Jared Bibler, who has written a book called Iceland's Secret, The Untold Story of the World's Biggest Con. And the reason this is an interesting story is it's kind of a microcosm. It's the only place I know of where people actually went to jail for the 2008 crash and some of the monkey business that went on. And Jared was a lead investigator on that team, and he's an expert in these types of white-collar crimes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, is it conspiracy? Is it real? What lessons can we learn? What does we've got a cryptocurrency, we've got a ton of stuff to unpack. But Jared started out as an engineering student, went to MIT, graduate, and went to Boston, went to New York, decided to move to Iceland in, I believe, 2004. And next thing you know, we have a financial crisis. And from then his life gets it was interesting before, it gets really interesting after. So with that brief introduction, Jared Bibler, thank you for being on the podcast. It's good to be with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy. It's really a pleasure.
This is going to be a lot of fun. So let's start with your background just a little bit. How does an engineering student shift to finance? And maybe start around there and bring us up to, just give us the saga about what brought you here.
I think I always wanted to be in finance. If I look back when I was in third grade, I grew up outside of Boston. We'd get the Boston Sunday Globe, and I would look at the business pages and I would look at the stock listings. But I was only like 9. I don't know what I was looking up, but I would just read those things and look at them. And I was fascinated by that. I studied engineering because I was interested in that, and my parents encouraged me to do something practical in my studies. But I think my heart was always wanting to be on Wall Street. So within a couple of years of finishing MIT, I was working in the back office as an IT consultant for one of the biggest Wall Street banks. I did that for about 5 years. I loved that. That was a great experience. I worked for some really colorful characters. They used to begin, actually, Iceland's Secret, the book originally kicked off on Wall Street. Had these great, and maybe in the second edition, I'll be able to put them back in. There's guys like the Hammer and Joe Cat and these really great Wall Street guys who kicked off the book. But I really burned out from that. I was working long days and weekends and stuff for about 5 years. And so I thought it was going to be a 1-year break in Iceland to just relax a little bit. I did a similar job there. I found a really cool opportunity there to do back office software for the growing Icelandic banks, and I thought, all right, I'll do this for a year and see. It was always my dream to live somewhere else and learn another language and so on. So that's how I got in there, and then I never looked back once I was there.
Yeah. So Iceland had I don't know if microcosm is a good word for it, but they went through some of the similar things that built up the financial crisis. First, it was really housing debt. We had zero down, no doc stated income loans. People were loaning money. You used to put down maybe 25% in equity and you'd get 75% in debt. Pretty soon they're loaning 110% of houses and zero down and no doc and stated income. They give a loan to anybody. And that seemed to happen all around the world. But the banks, they had more shenanigans than just, Bear Stearns and Lehman and Goldman, and these guys would package these collateralized debt obligations and sell them other places. But what made Iceland corrupt? Why was there so much corruption there?
Well, the scam in Iceland was much simpler than on Wall Street, but I think simpler but analogous, right? So, and I think also, by the way, analogous to what's happening today in the markets, as you alluded to, but very simple because, as you say, it's a small society. These banks started out in the late 90s. They were government controlled, and the government partially listed them, partially privatized them. But almost immediately, starting in 98, they started a program of buying up their own shares on the markets without telling anybody. So this is not like a normal share buyback where a company says, hey, we have excess profits. We're going to distribute them in the form of a buyback, and they tell you how much they're going to do. This was just secret every day. If the price slips a little bit, the bank traders come in with their bank's own money and push the price.
Yeah, they had one of them had a market cap, I think, around 5 billion, and they wind up owning 1.5 of the whole shares, propping it up, and then creating false entities to buy these, and shenanigans.
Yeah, it was kind of Enron style, and I brought up Enron because they were each about the size of Enron. But
there's three major banks we're talking about, right? Which none of them I can pronounce.
Right.
They have Icelandic names.
Now they've changed their names, but they're still there, by the way.
Yeah.
And I think they're all three now relisted again. And my friends there on the inside tell me they're right back today to 2006-07. It's the same thing again. So I think the book came out at a very good time, actually.
So how did you get that job? Because you're in Iceland, you're going to take a year. Next thing you know, you're unemployed. And what I think is most fascinating, and why I think this is worth a read, go to Amazon and pick this up. It's called Iceland's Secret: The Untold Story of the World's Biggest Con. And I think what makes it interesting is there's this big picture idea of what happened and all the fraud and the big banks, but there's also the personal experience you have of being in a country that experienced inflation, that had the value of their currency cut basically in half, which is interesting that 350,000 people, I think, isn't that the population right around in there of Iceland? Is it bigger than that?
It's now 350-ish. And
350-ish.
When I moved, so actually the population is growing fast, because when I moved there, I think it was 270.
Okay.
So people are having a lot of kids.
So you have your currency cut in half, and this is empty shelves, and where are you going to get your groceries? And, so you have this huge vision of the corporate problem, but you also have experience with the individual problem of what am I going to eat tomorrow? And I think that's a fascinating experience, because most of us never have. Now, I've spent some time in South America, where, Peru, Argentina, Paraguay, they've had those guys. Yeah, we've been through this. Dad told me about it, or I went through it. Mm-hmm. But I think people in my home country, the United States, and much of Europe, unless you had a grandfather in the Weimar Republic, have not experienced these types of things.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
So what's the lesson there?
Well, a friend of mine who's from Brazil, and he's got 3 passports, Brazil, US, Iceland. But he always says Iceland is the furthest north of the Latin American countries. It does have historically high inflation and kind of out of control central bank, and very shaky economy. It's really interesting because it's socially super developed, 100% literacy, fantastic women's rights. There were almost more women in parliament this last election a month ago than men. On the social side, it's arguably the most advanced. But on the economic, it's like the flip side of the U.S. In the U.S., you have a very advanced financial economy, but socially the country's not well developed, right? You have a lot of poverty and so on. Iceland is the flip side. You have very nice human development, but
it's clean. But
financial system is really the Wild West.
Wow.
And so you asked me how it was to live through that. It was a feeling of, this thankfully didn't last more than a couple of months, but it was very touch and go. There was a feeling of like total uncertainty. How much cash do I have in my wallet today? How much is that going to buy today? Can I get money out of the bank tomorrow? And so on, so our bank accounts a lot of our savings was in money market funds, not traditional bank accounts. We can get into why if you're interested, but those funds were then frozen at the crisis.
Your money markets were frozen.
Right.
That's fascinating, because if people were to ask me the difference between a money market and a savings, it would be liquidity. Because in your savings, they're taking that money and putting it in houses, where money markets generally invest in very liquid things, because they've got to earn money, but they can't break the buck. So it's very safe stuff.
Right.
treasuries, things like that.
We took, in real terms, so in nominal terms, the money market took a 30% haircut.
So it
forget about
broke the
breaking
buck by
buck. It has-
30%.
Yeah, but in real terms, as you said, because the currency at the same time lost half its value, in buying power terms, we lost 75% of what was in the money market fund. And that was my life savings at that
Wow.
point, or less.
And that's supposed to be the quote unquote one of the safest places because I don't know, as in Iceland, but in the US, the standard is you've got to have basically treasuries or commercial paper, stuff like that.
Turned out, so we talked a bit about the banks buying their own shares, and you alluded to they had to hide them somewhere. They
Right.
couldn't put them back on the market. One of the ways they hid them was in these investment companies, which bought the shares off the banks.
Shells.
How do you think those investment companies were financed? Money market loans, right? So
Unbelievable.
we were paying without knowing it
For the shares.
to support the shares. We were actually share owners. We didn't even know it.
That's just,
So, I
and
mean-
so you've got volatile and an Icelandic market, I would imagine is this, I mean, that could be didn't they lose like 97%
Yes,
of what I mean, the US
Yeah.
lost about half,
that's right.
but
I
they
think
lost all.
55 for the US, which is huge. 55%
Oh,
drop.
huge haircut, but 97 is everything.
Yeah.
That's all of it.
Because basically those three banks were more or less the market.
So here's the interesting thing. You talk about central banking and corruption and these types of things. The real estate market feels familiar, like it was going up like crazy. Housing prices. I bought some property and I'm thinking, wow, how is this worth this much now? All of a sudden, my own home. All this market is raging. If you'd have told me at coronavirus the market would be where it is right now, I'd have said there's just no way. There's no way this happens. So we have unprecedented support from central banks. And this isn't just the Fed, while they're leading the way. European Central Bank.
Oh, yeah.
Bank of Japan is easing. We have debt everywhere. It's almost as if the bad behavior on two fronts is not punished. First of all, from a capitalism point of view, I thought capitalism was about letting people fail. That's what I thought it was. I thought everyone says, well, these guys are dirty capitalists. Well, no, they're not capitalists at all because they can't fail. If you can't fail, you're not a capitalist. So you have a Bernanke put and now the Yellen put, and now they're calling it the Powell put. It's basically a central bank put that says, we're not going to let you fail. So doesn't that encourage extremely aggressive behavior because they're like, hey, they're not going, we can leverage and we can go crazy because then bail us out legally. And then on the other side, you look at the financial meltdown. I don't know what laws were broken in the US. Obviously, there were some pretty big Enron type shenanigans and the Enron guys went to jail. Ken Lay, he went to jail. So they were jailed, but go ahead.
So I learned this recently because I was a big student of Enron. I loved Enron. I loved to read about it after. And, there was a big pushback in the US because Arthur Andersen used to be the big five accounting firm.
Yep.
And because of the Enron prosecutions, Arthur Andersen failed and went out of business globally, as I think they should have.
Sure.
But there was a pushback in the Justice Department in the US after that. It was like, we can't do this anymore. We can't do this again because we don't have that many.
So that what you bring in your book that I think is fascinating is you have basically a safety net for big aggressive banks on the central banking side that does not really punish aggressive or irresponsible behaviors. And then on the other side, you have a Justice Department that also says, look, we can't, it's too big to fail on the criminal side, that if we prosecute this many criminals, it hurts too many non-criminals. I mean, that sounds kind of crazy to me, but is that their rationale?
The rationale was that it's too harmful to all the normal people who worked in those firms.
So letting the crime go on is less harmful than stopping the crime, is what their logic is.
That was I think I'm paraphrasing, but I think that was the gist of this DOJ memo in the mid 2000s.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that's why you didn't see so much prosecution in 2008. That's one of the main reasons, I believe. Now in Iceland, we only did prosecutions because the public demanded it. Because imagine if the market had gone down 97%.
Oh,
US,
yeah,
people
they'd have
would have been
won
on the
people's
street,
heads.
right?
Yeah.
So in Iceland, people were on the street. There's some colorful examples, as you know, in the beginning of the book, of burning down the Christmas tree from Norway in the middle of Reykjavik, right across from the Parliament building. People were really furious. And so the parliamentarians bowed to pressure and they appointed a special prosecutor. And then I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time to investigate those huge cases we talked about. But just like in the US, by 2011, so my team at this point, I finally had a little team of good investigators. Team was about a year old. And suddenly it was like, oh, it's time to stop investigating. And we had just scratched the surface, and so we did have that little window where we did a few prosecutions and they were all successful. Almost, these cases were just open and shut. They were so easy.
Yeah.
And there were many more of those. But the political pressure then, the people weren't on the streets anymore. And so the elites come back and say, it's because, those cases were going up the line to the head of the central bank, potentially, and other powerful politicians. And so it was like, let's close this down. And so they did.
Boy, it's a fascinating thing. So what parallels do you see? I mean, they say history repeats itself. And I struggle with this stuff because I feel that, as human beings, we have machinery in our psyche that can sometimes let us fall into apocalyptic thinking or conspiracy and Bigfoot. And there's a lot of psychological advantages to being a victim of a conspiracy. It makes us feel really a lot better if someone killed Kennedy and it was covered up, or if we didn't land on the moon, or if Bigfoot is out there, and so I'm just I don't like conspiracy. It bothers me. And yet the other part of life I know is that money, now there's, being abducted by aliens and having a flat earth is one thing, but when money is involved, I have seen that people will conspire and people will create, elaborate structures, both legal and illegal, to fill that greed. So my question is, what is the parallels you see between, 13 years ago and today?
I see, first of all, the disclaimer, like you say, I really did live through this and lose almost everything that I had saved. So I do have probably a dark lens through which I view the world. So, but putting that aside, what I see the parallels, and I think it really just comes down to this, it's the incentives. We have not changed the incentives in the system since 2008. So we're just building a bigger 2008, right? So we, as you said, we bailed out, and the big countries bailed out all the banks. Nobody goes to jail for things that were demonstrably criminal in the US and the UK and all the big countries. And the incentive, I saw this when I was briefly here in Switzerland. I was in charge of insider trading investigation for the stock exchange. The incentives for insider trading are great. If you do an insider trade that's going to make you $1 million, the incentive is $1 million.
Yeah.
But for the person on our team who is catching that or prosecuting that, there's almost no incentive. In fact, in some countries, there's an incentive to do nothing. I don't know if you got...
Depending on the level of corruption, you'd almost be afraid to, like if you live in Venezuela, if you want to be a whistleblower, your family probably gets abducted, right? I mean...
But it doesn't have to be Venezuela. It could be Switzerland, It could be a place where it doesn't pay to stick out. If you have a nice regulatory job, you're making a good salary, you're not going to make any more or less salary for going after this case. Whereas the people you're going after are going to make $1 million each time they do that thing. So it's completely askew. And we shouldn't be surprised when, as you say, these conspiracies to defraud develop. In the Icelandic banks, by the end, the whole bank had become a share buying and hiding machine that involved virtually every department. And you don't need to imagine that some Illuminati is pulling the strings. People are just responding to incentives. People just follow their incentives, and these things grow. They evolve naturally. It's
I
like
think,
Darwinian selection
yeah,
of the best fraud.
I think your comparison to Enron is a good one because it was funny when Schiller, when he stepped down and Ken Lay took over, the press just said, "Hey, why is he leaving?" Right? And he says, just bald face. He says, "We filed our 10Qs. Everything's with the SEC. If there's anything people had to worry, it would be in that report. We're in as financially strong a position as I've ever seen. We have plenty of cash." I mean, these are just bald face lies, right? Just bald face.
Yeah.
And so, that's a good comparison of a very real conspiracy of both fraud. As you look at 2008, the Fed started, Bernanke puts unprecedented easing in. We drop rates to zero.
Mm-hmm.
We start easing, in the billions, the tens of billions, really. And we do one round and we do another round. Then we do 50 billion a month for however long it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
And there was always this talk of unwinding this bailout, unwinding it. It's just wound bigger. In fact, even before coronavirus, if you look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve in the fall of 2019, they had tried to raise the interest rates before that, and the market just said, "No, we're not having this." And so then Powell said, "Well, we'll be patient." We went to patience. Right. And then even before coronavirus in that fall, they almost seemed to say, "You know what? Zero rates are the new normal. We're going to keep pumping this." It almost like you can almost see it on the chart of their financial statement where it just starts to go back up really heavily again. Mm-hmm. And so I think to myself, wow, what do I do as an individual investor? Do I prepare for inflation? Do I prepare for deflation? Because I really don't have much control over, what the guys on Wall Street do or what the guys in Washington, D.C. do or the European Central Bank. Any thoughts for the regular guy like me that just wants to invest well and build a legacy for his kids?
First, on the topic of the Fed and the other central banks, I think their hands are more and more tied, right? Because the world debt to GDP number is off the charts now.
Yeah.
So imagine if they would start to raise rates. You're going to have people who can't pay their debts because the rate went up 1 point. Suddenly you're going to have massive insolvency in corporates all around the world. You're going to, right?
And some are going to say, so what's wrong with that? Japan has had a debt to GDP of probably 230, 250 for how many years? And they seem to be doing okay. What do you say to that?
Yeah, maybe that's fine. Maybe
that's what they say.
Maybe
right? maybe it doesn't, we can perpetually print, perpetually borrow. We can borrow new to pay off the old. Which sounds like something you'd be prosecuted for in any other arena.
So you asked me about inflation. I don't know if you've looked at the M1 numbers for the US. I want to say off the top of my head that M1, so this is the money that's in cash, but also people's checking accounts, readily available money. I want to say that pre-COVID, that was 4 trillion and now it's 20 trillion. So
that's phenomenal.
It's kind of like a straight line.
Yeah.
I sent the chart to my friend the other day and I said, "Look at this." And he said, "You got to put a log scale on that chart." And I said, "This is with a log scale. It's still a straight line."
Oh, jeez.
And so I was expecting from last year some inflation this year, which seems to be happening now.
Yeah, we seem to be having a little bit. I just brought that. I just brought it up on Fred.
You brought up M1, yeah.
Yeah, just as we're talking here.
Are my numbers right?
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Let's look at 4. See the 4?
Yeah,
up to 18 and now it's 20. Right?
2020 was an interesting time, wasn't it? Yeah, and I'm kind of a nerd that I follow those numbers and think they're interesting. Let's talk about this. So I was very, very slow to, and I'm ashamed to say this because I'm an education advocate. That's like at the end of most of my podcasts, and I don't steer it there on purpose. It just always winds up there because I'm an education advocate where I say, look, systemically, these problems aren't within my power to solve, but individually, you can probably do some things if you're smart enough, hopefully, and disciplined enough that you can do well despite. The Fed balance sheet isn't mine. The Federal Reserve Bank, or the fiscal, on the fiscal side, the U.S. Treasury, that's not my debt, that's theirs. And hopefully I can survive this as an individual. So that brings in the discussion of crypto a little bit. I was very slow to do this simply because everyone I met that was excited about crypto seemed like they'd found a new religion to me.
Yes.
They were so dogmatic. It was going to be great, all upside. Whenever I hear people saying no downside, all upside,
Right.
my spidey sense says, let me tell you something. There's no such thing about, there's no risk. And if you don't know how to poke holes in your own asset class, you probably don't understand it very well.
Mm-hmm.
So in this instance, if you're living in Iceland and you'd have had more prevalent, Bitcoin's been around for a while, but if it was as available now and as easy to trade now as it was, or then as it was back now, Bitcoin probably would have made a lot of sense for someone in Iceland that would have been a lot better in that money market.
Yes, I think so.
So what's your thought on crypto?
Well, but also gold would have been great in Iceland.
Yeah, gold would have been good too. Yeah, that's true.
A brick of gold, it would have preserved its.
Well, now if you're going to be an apocalyptic thinker, though, they say, yeah, but I can't take my brick of gold on a plane because they confiscate that type of thing. I guess you got a big necklace in that case, right?
That's true.
I guess. But crypto, what's your thoughts on crypto?
I think it's really in its infancy, and I kind of think I've been using the analogy recently that it's like when the Netscape browser came out. I think it was in '94. That
caught my eye when you did that, because ironically, I've been using the analogy of Netscape and also WordPerfect remember the WordPerfect processor?
Yeah.
And the irony is both of those are gone now.
Yeah.
Because usually the first, the protocols are still around.
Yes.
Hypertext protocol. Netscape used Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP. So the protocol is still here, but the first wave of technology that used that protocol. So blockchain is probably a bigger deal than Bitcoin. Ethereum can do more in its blockchain technology than Bitcoin can, but Bitcoin's still kind of the word perfect. So
there's probably something coming down the pike that we don't know yet.
And AI, there might be a protocol that blows that. If you believe in the exponential nature of technology, I'm always poo-pooing it with obsolescence risk, but let me just say, I did use Netscape and I did use WordPerfect while it was prevalent. Right? I did use it. So you think Bitcoin's a big deal or crypto's a big deal?
I think it could be, but it's like my analogy with Netscape is people confused the browser for the internet.
Yeah.
So when Netscape went public, they were like, oh, this is my chance to own a piece of the internet. But they didn't realize that it could be accessed in different ways.
Yes.
And I think there's an analogy there with what's going on in crypto. There's something behind it that hasn't developed yet that is valuable, but I don't think we're there yet. And I see on the other side, as an ex-asset manager, I see some people doing things that seem really cool with crypto. Like they're saying they're going to, here, I don't know if this is still happening anymore, but here in Switzerland, someone was making a token, and inside the token was going to be a series of real estate investments.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds cool. Sounds great.
Well,
but who's checking the underlying properties, for example, against, you know what I mean? Like when you run an investment fund, there's rules and you got to send reports every quarter and so on. But this was kind of an end run around an investment fund, which to me could have all the problems that a normal real estate fund would have with even less checks on it. So that made me nervous.
If I'm still learning and studying blockchain, but let's say blockchain is a theoretically immutable ledger, It has three main checks on it. It has hashes that have to match up. It has, that's one level of security. You got to figure those out. And then you have the vast network that double checks every single piece of that ledger. So the computing power is vast to do that.
Yep.
Then you have time limitations of like 10 to 15 seconds, where if someone were going to change that, they have to change the whole ledger, and you only change a block every 10 seconds or whatever. So it'd take 1,000 years to do it. So there's all this technology that does it. But from someone who studied the fraud, to have a ledger that's immutable, that is spread out in transparency, that would probably make a lot of sense in terms of fraud prevention.
Yeah.
I would think.
That's cool. But what I understood from this real estate token was that, well, okay, fine. If you put every property on the blockchain somehow, and then that's all referenced, maybe. But someone still has to go and look at those properties and see if
there's a physical element,
shape, or
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough thing. But blockchain, the way we vote will probably change for the better. Contracts will probably, who knows where it's going to go. It's going to be interesting. The book that we're speaking about is called Iceland's Secret, The Untold Story of the World's Biggest Con. I think history's fascinating to study, and I think it's helpful to study because you can learn so much about what is happening today. They say there's a few ways to predict the future. Policy and demographics give you the future. Trends can kind of, they can change, but they can see where your future's pointed. But history also repeats itself if we don't watch out. If you want to know the future, study the past, because human nature doesn't change. It changes at an evolutionary pace, at a glacial, geologic pace. So people don't change very much. So pick up the book. Why did only one Wall Street executive go to jail in 2008? Why didn't we have, you said we're knocking these guys down in Iceland right and left. Of course, their sentences weren't very long.
Right.
And like you said, they changed their name, back in business, still doing things. But why were you guys able? Was it just like you said, because the pushback was more severe? It was worse than just half the money gone. It was like all the money gone.
People were on the streets all winter. In Iceland, winter is long and cold and dark.
Oh, geez.
3 months. You have 3 months where you have about 3 or 4 hours of light a day.
The way you said that was with such genuineness. Like it's long, it's cold, and dark.
It is. And so, but despite that, that's the time of year people are making Christmas pudding and lighting candles and being cozy inside. But people were on the streets in front of the parliament, standing in the snow. Housewives with pots and pans banging a wooden spoon on the back of a pan over and over.
Oh my gosh.
All day. People were furious because it's easy to look back and say, oh yeah, but it all worked out. But at the time, we didn't know where the next, if we'd have food the next month, or it was frightening to live through that.
What do you hope?
That anger propelled the prosecution.
What do you hope people take from your book? When you wrote this, and you say, when someone reads my book, I hope they experience this.
I think the story is so important that I had to tell it. The European magazine recently said, to understand how the world works, you need to understand this book, which I think is great. What do I want? Maybe it's a naive hope, probably is, but I was hoping that if enough people understood how dire things were there, and some people read this, they get really scared by the end. It's a fun book to read. It's a page turner, but when you get to the end and you think, a lot of people come to me and they say, geez, some very high in one of the big Swiss banks came to me privately last week and said, you wrote a book about our country. This is what's happened. You described it here. And so I'm hopeful that if enough people understand this, that maybe we can change something. Maybe we can head off the next huge financial crisis somehow, because I think otherwise that thing is coming for us. And I think 2008 is just a little preview of the attractions.
2008 didn't really happen like it could have happened, right? We really didn't experience, we put a Band-Aid on it, rolled the snowball up the hill.
Yep.
People say they kicked the can down the road. I go, no, they rolled a snowball up the hill. It got higher and it got bigger. It got higher and it got bigger. Because they never unwound any of that stuff. The balance sheets are bigger today than they've ever been. Like by far, it's an astounding. It takes your breath away when you look at just the chronology of it, how it's grown. So when that person feels all that fear and panic and says, oh my gosh, this is just a preview, we're in big trouble here. What do they do?
What do they do? Go out on the street with pots and pans? I don't know. I don't know what the next step is. I was just hoping that to make people more aware of this, and with that awareness, things could maybe change if enough people know this story. But some days I'm not hopeful. Like there's a lot of hostility to this book now. Also in Iceland, the bookstore in Iceland wouldn't carry it, for example.
Really?
And now enough people demanded it that they are carrying it. But at first they, no, 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 no. Well, we don't need that. We already know this story. But meanwhile, Icelanders who are reading it are writing to me privately and saying, wow, you're putting this all together so well. I didn't get it. But even here in Switzerland, I had an interview on a very popular finance site 2 weeks ago. And people wrote in things like, we don't have a crisis. This is an unnecessary discussion. There's really a hostile.
Really?
Yeah.
They don't want to hear it.
Years ago, and the more senior they are in the finance world or the political world, the less welcome is the message.
Of course.
I knew that, and that's why the book is targeted at the everyman. It's not a textbook, as you know. It's a fun book to read, and anybody can read it. I was giving a talk 5 years ago or so, 6 years ago here, when the first court verdicts in Iceland were coming out about these big cases. I could finally talk about them because before that they had been secret. So I'm giving a talk here to the CFA Society, which is, it's the CFA people. I'm also one. And everyone's well dressed. It's in one of the best restaurants at the main station in Zurich. I'm showing these amazing slides of the rise and fall of the stock market in Iceland and how the banks manipulated their shares. And Switzerland is a very buttoned up culture, especially in Zurich in the banking world. Nobody interrupts in a presentation. People are super respectful. They wait till the question time. But after about 5 minutes, a guy 2/3 of the way back, he almost jumps out of his seat. He's red-faced and angry. And he says, "This is impossible what you're telling us. This is just lies." He's just like beside himself with he's like apoplectic, that guy. And I was very calm. I'm proud of myself. Very calm. And I said, what is it that you don't like here? Why do you think I'm lying to you? And he said, well, the regulator would have stopped this,
And
he had reasons for why that would have been stopped. And for each of his reasons, I said how it was. The regulator is just like some 25-year-old kids who are not paid that much and just came out of law school, and to regulate these banks, credit operations, for example, there were only 5 people in Iceland.
When I feel the fears, because I am very transparent in saying, well, I don't know. People think that because I teach or because I invest a little bit, I must have this crystal ball, and I don't. Perhaps the defining characteristic of the markets are their unpredictability. Preparation, I think, is more important than prediction. The reason I think a book like yours is important is so people can read a story by someone that was there. I mean, you went through these spreadsheets yourself. You're not making this stuff up. You're the lead investigator on this. You're going through all these spreadsheets saying, well, this is interesting. This company that bought these shares does what? Very Enron-like. And so a person's left with what to do. And I think you prepare. And I think that preparation is mental, of course, with what we learn. We want to be educated on investments and hedges. And number 2, there's where I failed often and made mistakes is in my discipline, where my feelings and my emotions have overcome my intellect, which I think is a human folly we all deal with and manage. And then I think it's important to have a team and a community around you. I was in a really interesting meeting where they had a guy come in who's a famous author who talks about, he's not a prepper, but talks about the end of the world a lot, type of stuff, financial meltdowns. And everyone was talking about what's the most important asset. Is it gold? Is it real estate? Is it stocks? Is it cash? Is it Bitcoin? What do you want to have? And he goes, greatest asset you have is your community, the neighborhood you're in.
Yeah.
Because if you need something to eat, you can still figure it out with a community like that. So
that saved us in Iceland as the community, because it's a tight knit place,
Yeah.
And I think if it had happened in another country, a bigger country, it would have been much more of a problem even.
I think it really speak to, like in the United States, where you live. Right? There's certain areas where the community would be like, oh, I would not want to be in this community. And others where I'm like, yeah, that's going to be the strength of where I live to help me through. So I don't like apocalyptic thinking. I don't like fear mongering and scaring people. But if there's a reality to study and look at, and there's facts, it's important to update beliefs based on evidence and based on facts. And so if we can find a book with facts, and that helps us update my belief and my motivation and my cuts off procrastination of learning, I think you've done people a wonderful service. So any final words? You've been gracious with your time, and it's really been fun usually I don't get a chance to do it. This will be an audio, but we actually did this one on Zoom, so I get to see the person that I'm interviewing. Right. It's really fun. There's so much to that. But any final thoughts on the book, on the Parallels Today, what you'd say to people in the United States? We have a global audience, so it really doesn't, it's not just a US thing, but what do you have to say to people? Last words.
I think, well, thanks for having me, and it's been a pleasure. And I think all the stuff that I describe it's not apocalyptic. This stuff could be fixed really easily. We could work this out in a couple of months, really. There are ways to get the incentives right so that regulators get a bonus when they bring in a big case. And imagine the great cases we'd have. Imagine all the Enrons we'd have if you incentivized regulators to be like real police and to say, okay, you bring in $1 billion case, you get 1% or whatever. I mean, that would be awesome. And just get the journalists ready to roll with those headlines, because it would be fantastic. It would probably be a time of great change, right? But I think we would be building a really something that was sustainable for the future. I think when people 1,000 years from now look back on us, they're going to say, those rubes, like they didn't know how to run a financial system that could even last 20 years. They built such shaky systems. Well, that we will have learned. And so, yeah, and I'm optimistic. I think we're going to have to.
I would hope people also would use the power of capitalism. I get nervous about incentive for anybody, because it seems that whenever there's incentive, there's corruption. And so, the worst thing I want is someone to say, well, let's go bring down these capitalist guys because we get a bonus if we do. But I'll tell you, I really like the idea of the public seeing what's going on and voting with their dollars. Mm-hmm. Because if I see a bank that is having shenanigans and the public knows about it, well, you can cut them off pretty darn quick, because you just quit spending your money.
Absolutely.
If people don't like
transparency, right? That's another.
There you go. I like that idea. If people don't like Walmart, well, great, go to Target. If you don't like Delta, well, United is there for you. And right. I love the idea of being able to bring people down by no longer giving them my money. Mm-hmm. But that takes education. It really, really does. So this has been delightful. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I get to start my day. What time is it in Zurich?
It's almost 6 p.m.
Oh, so it's perfect. So my day's getting started. Yours is winding down. But what a great way to start my day. I get to speak to these fascinating people. We've been speaking with Jared Bibler. His book is Iceland's Secret, the untold story of the world's biggest con. A lot of lessons there. Maybe you can take some for yourself and get ready for lessons to come. You've been listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast. I'm Andy Tanner. This is where we try to make investing simple. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner. For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.